Cameron, thank you very much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited to be here.
Have you ever been to Spokane?
I have a few times.
Okay. We're finally attracting a lot of attention here. There was a article, I think 2 weeks ago in GeekWire that highlighted kind of an interesting statistic, which was that there were the increase in job openings in Spokane was highest in the nation on the Indeed platform, second only to Boise, Idaho.
That makes sense. I remember when I started in this industry maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I saw very few startups coming out of Spokane, but over the past few years, I mean, that's completely changed.
Yep.
So we met with one a few weeks ago, actually, and seems like, I don't know if they changed the water over there, but something positive is going on in that ecosystem.
I think it's kind of the combination of the ability to work from home and the broader acceptance of remote work as well.
Right, completely. That's right.
And people growing increasingly frustrated with larger cities.
Yes. Yeah. Quality of life is definitely, in some areas way better out there.
Yep. Did you, is Spokane or Seattle your hometown?
Yeah, I grew up in Redmond, Washington. So on the east side, had a traditional upbringing there, had one younger brother. Both my parents immigrated here from Iran and worked at Microsoft and Boeing, so very classic immigrant story. Then I went to the University of Washington and then went down to the Bay Area for a while before making my way back.
Excellent. So I know one of your people on the Fuse team is John Connors. My first job out of college a long time ago was with Deloitte Haskins and Sells.
Oh, yeah.
And John and I would spend the month of February in Montana together auditing a company over there. And then one day he announced he was going to go to this new company called Microsoft, like as an assistant payroll clerk or something. I'm making that up, but really kind of for an entry-level position. And we're all kind of scratching our head. And obviously flash forward, that was a very good move for him. Yeah,
it's a very good move. And I was very lucky to learn from John during my time at Ignition Partners. He's just, one of the best board members, operators, and how that translates into working with entrepreneurs is just, it's fun. It's been fun to witness. And then as we launched Fuse, which we'll get into, he's increased his involvement with us at Fuse. And so he's in the office, actually. Most days he's in the office today. So it's a lot of fun to work with him.
Excellent. Well, be sure to say hi to him for me. We've kept in touch a little bit over the years, and he actually did one of my programs here a year or so ago.
Perfect.
We'll give it a few more minutes and then we'll kick this off. Looks like we're getting good participation. I think we got most people, so we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to start with kind of thanking Rick Rep and Witherspoon Kelly. They are the sponsors of Meet the Investor. And Rick is on the call today. Also want to do a shout out for Rick. He's also a board member of Ignite and also on the board of the Spokane Angel Alliance, and clearly one of the more active attorneys in Spokane, working with entrepreneurs, startups, tech companies on both financings and mergers and acquisitions. And Rick, do you want to introduce Cameron for us today?
Sure. Thank you, Tom. Cameron, welcome to an Ignite event here. We're pleased to have you join us. For those that are joining us today, Cameron is with the venture firm of Fuse, which is based in Seattle. It focuses on early stage software investments, and Cameron is a general partner there. He previously worked as a principal at Ignition Partners, and then also as a co-founder of Curious Capital, all of which have focused on technology companies in the Pacific Northwest. And Cameron also has a background, well, I should say a degree, a Bachelor of Science degree in business administration and finance from University of Washington. So please, let's give Cameron a warm welcome. We're glad to have you here telling us what you're seeing in the local market.
Excellent. Thanks, Rick, and thanks, Cameron. Today's format is kind of a fireside chat. Even though we have no fire and it's actually quite cold outside here in Spokane. I have a kind of a list of questions for Cameron today to kind of vet out his background and the firm's focus. But I really do want this to be interactive. So if the participants today have questions, present them to me in the chat function, and then I will call on you. So really do hope this is interactive and encourage questions. But I think we'll just jump right into it. And I think, Rick alluded to it a little bit, but maybe if you could kind of give us, your own narrative of your background and talk about some of the things that you did prior to co-founding Fuse in mid 2020.
Yeah, you got it. You got it. So I appreciate the background, everyone, and excited to be here. And a little bit about myself. So I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest, and that was an awesome experience. It's great to be from this region. Went to the University of Washington, studied finance, and didn't really know what venture capital was at the time, but I heard a lot of smart people were going into investment banking. So I thought, okay, might as well give that a try. Was very lucky to get to join a firm based in San Francisco that hired a lot of people from schools that weren't necessarily target, weren't the Harvards and Stanfords of the world, but wanted people with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder and something to prove. So I joined an investment bank down in San Francisco, and I like that quite a bit, actually. I mean, investment banking is a tough business in the sense that you work with a client for a few months, maybe 3 to 6 to 9 months. But then when when a transaction happens, either a M&A event or some sort of a financing event, you get paid and you move on. And that's the part of the business I really didn't like. So I got to work with these founders that have built incredible software businesses, oftentimes for 5, 10, 15 years. And then as they were going through that liquidity event and selling their baby, we were the quarterback or founder therapist at times, helping them through that transaction. So I knew I liked working with founders. I knew I liked early stage software and technology, but what I didn't like was the short-term nature of the relationship in investment banking. So set my sights on venture, but then I also set my sights on getting back to the Pacific Northwest. Saw this ecosystem going up and to the right, and knew I wanted to build a reputation in an ecosystem that was much smaller than the Bay Area, although had a lot of potential and was emerging very, very quickly, primarily in enterprise software. So I moved back. I quit my job, moved back, didn't have a job, which I don't give that feedback to when I talk to young people. But I moved back, and my old boss introduced me to a guy that used to run corporate development at Microsoft. And he was giving me some advice and said, hey, Cam, if you want to do venture capital and venture investing, you should just start doing it. And I said, well, I don't come from a family with a ton of wealth where I can just start writing 50, 100K checks into startups. He said, okay, well, I'll back you. So I'll invest in you, and I'll open up my network of people, and you can go out and pitch them and see if you can raise a fund. And so that's exactly what we did. We went out and raised a little under $1 million to write around 50K checks into early stage technology business. So that was fun. I got to increasingly build my network in the region and actually practice the craft of venture investing, albeit at a small scale. Got to meet a lot of the key players, and through that experience, and even before that, during my time at the investment banking, I got to know the folks at Ignition. I got to know John Connors and my partner now, Kellen Carter, and I had identified them as what I thought was the A team in town in terms of how they interacted with entrepreneurs and their reputation and the types of investments they were making. For some reason, I had my sights set on working there. And lucky for me, the stars seemed to align, and hiring in these early stage venture firms can be very sporadic. Oftentimes is tied to a successful fundraise. And so luckily the stars aligned and I ended up joining Ignition in early 2017 as an associate.
Fantastic. I mean, it's not easy to break into both investment banking and venture capital out of the U of W. Ironically, you and I both have somewhat similar backgrounds. I also went to the U of W. I was also in investment banking, and then I left, and in the late 90s and early 2000s had my own venture capital fund as well. So I share your passion, and it's a great story. So, but after Ignition, you were there for what is also looks like I looked like you had a great track record when you were out writing $50,000 or $100,000 checks. It looks like you had several exits from that time frame. So you had the wind at your back.
Yeah, we were very lucky to get into some great businesses, and that was definitely nice. It's funny, I was just thinking about this. A number of the founders that we backed out of that fund that have exited have now invested in our current fund, Fuse, and every single one of the LPs that backed that previous fund is now a Fuse LP as well. And so it's this is a long-term relationship business. You never know how you might meet a company or a limited partner, an investor, and so we just try to treat people the right way every single day and do the right thing.
Yep. So what inspired you to leave Ignition and go out and start Fuse?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ignition's a great place, and so it was around for 2 decades. For folks that don't know, it was founded by ex-Microsoft and Macaw Cellular telecom execs, and they invested across 6 funds thematically. Early on, it was across consumer, telecom, and enterprise software. And really what happened is a lot of the big wins ended up coming from enterprise software. And so they right-sized the firm to focus on enterprise software, opened up an office in the Bay Area. John Connors was the general partner that led the firm in Seattle, and another guy named Mick Sturielli led the firm in the Bay Area. And so I was part of the Seattle team, really leading and driving investments in this region in the Pacific Northwest. And so we invested primarily at the seed, but primarily at the Series A stage at Ignition. And it was a great experience. We were able to get into some phenomenal businesses like Icertis that recently got valued at over $5 billion from SAP. We own 13% of that business, able to get into a company like Carbon Robotics, which is building advanced manufacturing and equipment for the agriculture space, and a lot of other fun drivers that really drove the success of Ignition's Fund 6. And it came time, as a lot of funds, it comes time, but they rarely ever get this right. Venture funds rarely ever get the generational handoff and transition right, because it's not like a company. Oftentimes the folks that at the top, they don't typically have a ton of incentive to drive that generational transition. We're very lucky that John Connors was at a stage of his life where he loved doing what he does, which is investing in great companies and then working with them post-investment, but he didn't want to commit to another 15 plus years, which is really what it is every time you commit to a fund as a key man to limited partners. And so that, combined with the fact that we were the ones sourcing and finding a lot of these fast-growing opportunities in the Pacific Northwest, it created a huge opportunity for us to spin out and launch a fund of our own. And so we launched Fuse in early 2020, right before COVID, and it's been a lot of fun since, and I'm happy to jump into that. But very grateful for my time at Ignition. Yep. Very grateful to have learned from John Connors over from my time there, and it really springboarding off a platform that it built for 2 decades is a great way to start a new brand and a new fund.
Yep. Is there any particular meaning behind the name Fuse?
Yeah. So my partner Kellen actually thought of this name. We wanted something that had ties back to Ignition, a little bit of a play on words. And he's from Montana. He was in Montana, and he was out hunting with his brother, and he was wearing Allbirds. And it was snow. There was snow on the ground. He's walking around in Allbirds. And so his feet started to get cold and started to freeze. And he was telling his brother, "Hey, I wish we could start a fire. I wish we had like a match or a light or some sort of fuse." And he's like, oh, Fuse, that's an interesting concept to name. And we wanted to give tribute back to the folks that started Ignition and the legacy that's been built here, and thought Fuse did that.
Okay. I should have connected that. Okay. Excellent. Well, why don't we can you kind of summarize, what the firm's focus is, both in terms of industry and stage and geography?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A little bit of background on how we got Fuse off the ground. We launched the fund February 24th, 2020, right before COVID, right before you started to hear things like 2 weeks to stop the spread. I don't know if any of you remember hearing that phrase thrown around, and fast forward, we've been in this for 2 years, but at the time, we kept thinking, hey, it's just going to be a couple week delay on the fundraise, and we can get back to meeting people in person. Well, that turned into a month, turned into 2 months, and then at the time it was just Kellen and I. We said, okay, we got to go, we got to get this done. And so our initial cohort of limited partners are essentially a lot of the leaders in the Seattle and the Pacific Northwest business community. So name a Fortune 500 company that's based here. We have an executive at that company as a limited partner in the fund. And so these are folks that knew us, they knew John, but they were never really involved formally with any of the Ignition funds. We went out to them and pitched them on the idea of building a fund focused on owning the early stage in the Pacific Northwest, and they were willing to attach their names and also their time to help the companies that we back. And so that's been a huge differentiator of Fuse, as our limited partners are a lot of these strategic execs in the area versus not just endowments, pension funds, and institutional investors. So we got the fund raised, 170 million to back pre-seed, seed, and Series A entrepreneurs building in the Pacific Northwest. We'll invest anywhere from 500K all the way up to 8 million out of this fund, and that'll increase out of fund two. And we're typically leading rounds, getting to know these founders early, putting the terms together, working very closely with the companies. We take board seats on about half the businesses, particularly the ones the late seed and Series A. And it's our goal to deliver the best product for entrepreneurs and the product that they really deserve.
So early stage, you said pre-seed, seed, and Series A, primarily B2B enterprise software, and geography, Washington State, Northwest.
Yeah. We use Pacific Northwest very broadly.
Okay.
So Seattle, all of Washington, Spokane. We also mean Idaho. Might as well lump Montana into that. We mean Oregon, British Columbia, Vancouver, and then we also lump Calgary into that as well.
Okay. There's a lot going on in Calgary these days.
There is a lot going on. In Calgary. We've made one investment in Calgary out of Fuse. We made one investment previously during our time at Ignition. We've made 4 investments now in Vancouver.
Okay.
And so, we're not exclusive to the region, but about over 95% of the capital has been deployed in the Pacific Northwest.
Okay.
And in terms of categories, we'll go a bit more broad than we have historically during our time at Ignition on categories. So we really focus broadly on 3 things. One, enterprise software, as you mentioned, absolutely. Yep. We that's our bread and butter. We love that. We also do a lot of vertical software. And so companies tackling spaces that have been operating in, the same way for a number of years, whether it's healthcare, financial services, manufacturing, supply chain, insurance. We absolutely love those businesses. And the last one is B2B marketplaces. Mm-hmm. Given the amount of incredible marketplace talent you have in this region, obviously through Amazon and others, we're starting to see a large number of those companies pop up as well. And sometimes we've made one small consumer investment, so we'll look at consumer investments, but it's really a function of the talent that's in the Pacific Northwest. And then all those, the broad themes that we invest behind are, a lot of those companies have an AI or deep learning component, given the amount of talent in this region and ecosystem.
I think on your website or in one of your blogs, it says the Pacific Northwest is the most important technology ecosystem in the world.
Yeah.
That's a powerful statement. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, it comes down to a few things. One, there's no city in the world that has as much software market cap as the Pacific Northwest. And that might be obvious with Microsoft and Amazon being based here, but Google Cloud is based here. You know, Salesforce's HQ2 with Tableau is based in Seattle. Facebook, Snapchat, Uber all have massive engineering offices up here. And so the top technology businesses are picking this as the cloud capital of the world. And the internet's pipes all flow through the Pacific Northwest. This call that we're having right now, it's flowing through one of those large 3 cloud providers through the Pacific Northwest. Combine that with the fact that it's the #1 city in the US for AI talent.
Yep.
And, you know, it's in terms of software, there's no city in the world that's important.
Yep. I think also every year Forbes or Fortune comes out with the list of the top brands in the world. And the last time I looked at that list, 20% of the companies were based in Seattle. You know, Amazon, Nordstrom, Starbucks, and it is a powerful geography. Hey, one question about your fund. First time fund, 170 million. You mentioned that, you know, most or a lot of the, you know, more successful tech entrepreneurs in Seattle are part of it. Did you bring in any, you know, kind of traditional institutional limited partners into that fund, or was it primarily, you know, individuals and family offices? And
yeah, we did.
okay.
And so the first, call it 100 million, came from these strategic execs. Over 150 of these folks' names and brands that you recognize in the Pacific Northwest. You know, you mentioned a lot of them, and you know, Boeing, Nike, T-Mobile, just the iconic brands in this region. But then towards the tail end of our fund, especially given when we were fundraising, a lot of institutions were taking a pause to figure out what COVID meant for them. And then during the back half of that fundraise, a lot of those institutions were able to come up for air and say, okay, I'm now ready to start meeting with new managers. And so we were able to get rubber stamped by some of the top fund of funds and venture consultants in the world.
Well, congratulations. That's not easy to do for a first-time fund to be able to raise that amount. So clearly, you and your team had something special in your background and a kind of a differentiated pitch. So once you find a company that, you know, kind of fits your criteria by stage and by industry and geography, what are some of the other key factors, the soft factors, or other things that you look for before you make an investment?
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing for myself personally is team. And it's just, there's a number of ways that we get to know the team. Part of our strategy is to get to know founders early, way before they're in a formal financing process, and actually get to know them as people, have them over to our houses, go out and get a drink or dinner, or take them out to a ball game or whatever the founder likes to do for fun, or go for a walk. And so as the rest of the venture world has gone increasingly remote and gone increasingly global, we're doubling down on local and developing real relationships with these folks. Mm-hmm. And so that's step one. And then step two is underwriting their ability to hire top tier talent, particularly with founders that aren't repeat founders, first time founders, is what's their ability to go out and hire a VP of sales, for example, that has 10, 20 years more experience than them? Are they going to be, you know, self-conscious and you know, protective and not want to bring someone on that has some level of experience? Or are they going to jump all over the intro that we make, for example, and whether they hire them or not, just provide real feedback in terms of, hey, here's how they're a fit, and really understanding how quickly you need to move to hire the top talent in this ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So we try and get a lot of that work done pre-investment. And the second thing on the team that we look for is customer obsession early on. You know, the types of companies that we're not investing in are the ones that are like, okay, we built this product, and if you as the customer can't use it, then and that means you're too dumb to use it, and that's not our problem. The best companies have this crazy obsession with their customers early on, and go up over and beyond on the customer success side to make sure their early customers are happy, especially when the product typically isn't fully built.
Yep.
And then beyond that, it's market and team. I mean, on market, this is more standard across the venture industry, but we won't we underwrite every investment that we make to a $1 billion plus outcome, but increasingly more to like 2, 3 to 5+ billion dollar outcome. Every investment that we make has to have the potential to return the fund and really be a category winner. And then on product, we like products that have some sort of maybe a data moat or some sort of a stickiness that increases their moat over time. Whether it's a company that's powered by AI or ML, and over time the data they're collecting helps them get smarter and builds more of that moat or whatever it is, but some sort of long-term differentiation on the product.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a deep dive, and that's very helpful. In terms of recruiting, how are, obviously there's a shortage of talent right now.
Yeah.
How are you viewing the trade-off between hiring people and having them relocate or work remote?
For our companies?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a because we're in the office every single day. Fuse is, but for our companies, every one of them is a little bit different. But what we're seeing increasingly more and more over the past 6 months is more and more of them want a physical presence in the Pacific Northwest. At least they want their senior leaders and in the office, and increasingly employees are starting to ask for some sort of a place to go that's not their home. Yeah. Now there are founders who are better than others, I think, at managing remote teams.
Yep.
And that can be great because you can hire particularly engineering talent around the world. But if you don't have the right systems and processes in place to effectively manage that, folks, it's not super easy. It's not as easy as people make it out to be. Yep. And it's tough to replace being in a room, having a whiteboard, and being able to talk about it and hammer it out. And yeah, that's something that we've had companies that I think probably thought it would be easier than it is, and are now going back and saying, okay, we need some sort of a physical place, whether it's everyone's in the office every single day, or that might be a select few, but most of them are saying we want something, we want something physical. And so particularly the senior leadership teams. Yep. We have a number of companies that have done really well at recruiting engineering talent across the world. Particularly one of our companies, Zuper, for example, the co-founders based in India and manages a large technical team in India. Another company, Jigs, the founders based in Europe and manages a large engineering team in Prague. We see that model work well when you have a leader in that region that's really managing and driving a lot of the engineering resources there. And but we might be a little bit old school in that respect. Some of my peers in venture would be like, doesn't matter where you are, who cares? You don't need to be in the same area. But I think we're a little bit old school and think that you can't replace that in-person human brainstorming and interaction. Yep,
I tend to agree with you, and I'm older than you, so I'm really old school, but particularly for an early stage company, and I founded an e-commerce company several years ago. Yeah. And so I know just from that experience, the early days and everybody being in the room together, and thinking about the various challenges and opportunities that face a young company, and being able to interact just in a spontaneous setting. I mean, just the importance of that. But things are changing, and I presume the technology will catch up, and remote work at an early stage will be accommodated. But it's still a little kludgy. Kind of a related question. Cameron, you still there? Okay.
Yep, I'm still here. Yeah.
So kind of a related question. My last question was, once a company fits your criteria, what other factors do you look at? The world's kind of awash with capital right now, and there's a lot of venture money out there. So when you're out talking to early stage companies, how do you differentiate yourselves such that if they're talking to other firms, that they say, you know what, I want to work with Fuse?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, that's the fun part of the job. Right, is the winning. I think in order to do venture well, you have to do 3 things well. You have to be able to find businesses. And at the early stage, it's very hard to find, particularly when there's no online presence. It could be 5 people in some random house in Spokane or some random neighborhood in Seattle. Why are you going to be the first person in the world to hear about this company? And so that's step one, is you have to put yourself in a position to find these businesses. And that's what worries me at night. That's what keeps us up at night, is thinking, there's a company being founded right now, probably 5 blocks away, that I haven't heard about yet. And so that fuels us. And then it's winning, which is to your point, that's the fun part. You meet the founder, you get to know them, you do the work, and you decide, hey, this is an opportunity that we want to invest in. If you want to invest, turns out there's a bunch of other venture funds that want to invest too. So if we do our job, we're meeting that company very early and hopefully have some sort of proprietary access. But inevitably, there are times when you get pulled into more of a financing process and a financing round, and it does get more competitive. And so in those competitive situations, that's when we lock our limited partner community. And so we have a lot of these iconic business leaders and executives proactively reach out to the CEOs, call the CEOs. If they're a football fan, Bobby Wagner's a venture partner on our team. He'll cold call, cold FaceTime the founder, and getting a cold email from, for example, the CEO of Starbucks or Bobby Wagner, one of these executives. And if you're based in the Pacific Northwest, that's something that you want to talk to your family about. Like, that's something you want to brag about and share. And the fact that these people are willing to get on the phone and actually call the entrepreneur and spend time talking them through, what's it like working with Fuse versus some of the other firms we're talking about. It's one of the reasons that our win rate has been so incredibly high. So that's a piece of it. And the second piece is our ability to move quickly with urgency once we are over the line and excited. And so I think, a knock on the Pacific Northwest over the past 2 decades is there's been a sense of conservatism built into this ecosystem, and it's operated very differently from San Francisco, for example. In some ways, for good, in good ways, but in other ways, particularly the conservatism about how we interact with founders. We're trying to bring a little bit of that, a little bit more heat, a little bit more passion, a little bit more of a Bay Area approach to how we interact with these entrepreneurs. And so it's our goal to every time be the first term sheet if we're excited.
Yeah.
We never care about who else is investing in the round. If we're excited, we have the conviction. We're sending the term sheet. We're looping in the whole team. We're figuring out where they live. We're one of the investments that I made. I didn't know where the founder lived exactly, but I knew that there was the rough area of where they live. So I drove out to a Starbucks with the term sheet and a bottle of champagne and said, I'm not leaving until we get this thing signed. and it took 6 hours. Founder made me stay there for 6 hours. And it was a Starbucks inside of a Safeway. And those aren't necessarily the most glamorous Starbucks to be camping out at for 6 hours. But doing things like that to bring the energy and win on those particularly competitive investments. That's the fun part of the job.
Yep. Well, I can certainly see what an advantage it must have to have all of these other kind of leaders in technology in the business community, working for you to ensure you get the deals that you want. That's a huge advantage. We have a question from Graham Moorhead that kind of relates to how you might work with companies after the investment. Graham, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I have a good question. And then I have a response to something you said a few minutes ago. So after you invest in a company, obviously you can do things like open up your Rolodex and help them find, maybe new sales. But what is your philosophy for helping a newly invested startup?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was the third piece of what I forgot to mention from the last thing is building, working with companies post-investment. We're very lucky. It depends on the stage of the company. If it's a Series A and we're leading the round with a large check, typically we'll take a board seat. If it's a pre-seed or seed round, typically our level of engagement is up to the founders. It typically looks like a 30-minute call every month where we're touching base, particularly on product development and finding ways to be helpful. And so the ways that we add value is, one, just being involved and unlocking our limited partner community with help on 2 things: customers and talent. and using our LPs as a sandbox customer set to go sell into. And then also just we communicate very actively with them. And so if there's a company that needs a VP of sales, like we know the right people to call and start running that search. I spend a lot of my time as a part-time recruiter for the companies. In fact, that's one of the things we need to systematize more in Fund 2 and 3. But customers and talent through our LP communities. And the last thing is we have 2 incredible operators. One, Tom mentioned, is a guy named John Connors, who was an early Microsoft executive, has been on the board of Nike and Splunk, ran Ignition for the past decade. He goes deep with the companies that we back. We have another operating partner named Sapir Kanuja, who's an early Amazon executive, was on Jeff Bezos' senior leadership team for 7 years, and then ran an Ignition-backed portfolio company. And so they're very helpful in going deeper, particularly with certain companies where their expertise matches up.
Quick follow-up to something you said before. You said one of your great fears is not knowing about that next company that could be right down the street.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people in this call that are connected to a lot of different things. How could we reach you if we come across that next thing?
Yeah, email is great. I don't know if you all have my email. I'll put it in the chat right now if that works. But we try to be very, very accessible and very responsive.
Fantastic. Hey, just you mentioned your team. How did it turn out that a Seahawks football player is on a venture fund team?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Bobby is one of the most humble, and also like he just wants to learn it all. And so when he got drafted to the Seattle Seahawks, he graduated, or he left Utah State. He went through Utah State's alumni, and one of the folks that had graduated Utah State is a guy named Charlie Denson, who was the president of Nike. And so he cold called Charlie and asked Charlie, "Hey, I got drafted by the Seattle Seahawks. I'm moving to Seattle. Who do I need to know in town?" And Charlie said, "Hey, if you're moving to Seattle, you got to spend time and get to know John Connors." And so over the past 10 years, John has been a big mentor to him.
Okay.
And then about 4 or 5 years ago, Bobby said, "Hey, I'm getting pitched all these investment opportunities. How do I go about diligencing them?" And John said, "Hey, I didn't realize you had an interest in that stuff. Why don't you come to the Ignition office and spend time with Cam and Kellen?" And so that's how Kellen and I got to know Bobby, is through him spending time when we were at Ignition, understanding and learning the business of venture capital and venture investing, and just built a relationship with him professionally and personally, and just really liked him. And so when we launched Fuse, he had an interest in being more involved. We saw very, very unique ways that he could add value to the founders, to the companies that we back. And I'm happy to talk through some examples of that. And so it then just ended up being a match made in heaven. And so, for example, one of our companies had a big contract in front of a Fortune 500 enterprise. Bobby did a networking event and a wine and sip night with all their executives. The contract was signed like a few days later. One of them was selling a VP of sales who just happened to be a massive Seahawks fan. Bobby cold called that VP of sales and helped convince them that this was the right company and why, and shared a little bit about Fuse. And so very, very unique ways for him to help the portfolio companies, and also for him to decide if this is something, that a career that he wants to pursue when it comes to life outside of football. He wants to play for another 10 years. He wants to beat Ray Lewis in terms of number of years played. So fingers crossed, knock on wood, that's not going to happen anytime soon, but he's a lot of fun to work with.
I bet. What a great combination of skill sets he has.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody we have another 20 minutes with Cameron. So if you have questions, put them into the chat. I do see we have a question from Dan Rourke, and Dan runs a digital pathology company in Spokane that is using artificial intelligence. So Dan, you want to ask your question?
Sure. First of all, Cameron, I love how you guys are leaning in with groups. You don't often hear that. I mean, you get a little bit of maybe noise about helping, but maybe certainly not at the level I'm hearing that you guys are leaning in, which is great to hear. I'm curious, to learn a little bit more about kind of how you guys are invested in the healthcare space, and then if you have any investments in the Spokane area currently.
Yeah, so I'll take the second question first. No, we don't have any investments in the Spokane area currently, but we want to change that. So keep me honest there in a year or two. On the healthcare side, we have looked at quite a few healthcare companies. We've made one investment in the space. It's a B2B marketplace called Button, BTTN. What they do is they're building a marketplace for medical supplies for particularly the long tail of providers, dentist office clinics, and not necessarily the large massive hospital groups, although they will get there. And this is an incredible business. I mean, providing their customers with transparency on their medical supply costs and easy ordering and the medical supply industry and some of the large organizations that control that. You probably know it's very opaque. They don't do a very transparent job in pricing. Inventory is tough to understand. So that business Button has done incredibly well. And we've looked at a number of other healthcare investments. We haven't made any others yet, but like the industry and category a lot. We made one investment at Ignition called Kensai, and one of our advisors is a guy named Nader Niani, who runs one of the largest healthcare funds in the world called Fraser Healthcare Partners, based here in Seattle. And so we got pretty deep, we got pretty good ties into the industry, but have only made one investment.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Appreciate hearing that.
Yep.
So I think your website said you've made 17 to 18 investments so far. You're looking to make 25 or 30. You've highlighted a few of the investments you've made. Are there others in the portfolio that might be a good representation of the types of investments that you're making that you could share with us?
Yeah. So I've talked about. I mentioned Button. That's a great business. I'll talk about another one because it's fun to talk about, although it's not necessarily perfectly represent. It doesn't perfectly represent, but it's this business called Carbon Robotics. And what Carbon Robotics does, this founder started a company called Isilon Systems that went public and then sold to EMC for $2.25 billion. He was the director of engineering there. He then ran the deep learning team at Uber. And then he started Carbon Robotics. And what Carbon is solving is one of the biggest problems for the agriculture industry and for farmers, which is weeding. And so right now, a lot of farmers, the way that they currently get rid of their weeds is one of two methods. They either use herbicides, companies like Monsanto that make Roundup, and you're starting to increasingly see the harmful effects that has not only on the farmers' families, but also the downstream effects on how that affects our food. And then secondarily, they solve this problem with manual labor. People coming up, primarily migrant labor coming up from Mexico to hand weed the acres. And so Paul identified this problem, and what he built was this massive, large machine and implement that gets pulled behind a John Deere tractor and actually identifies using deep learning what is a weed versus what is a plant, and kills the weed using a laser. And so it's one of the coolest applications of deep learning artificial intelligence I've ever seen to solve a real world problem that doesn't, it's not just technology built for people that live on the coasts. It solves a real problem for the stewards of our planet, the reason all the food gets to us. And this company is doing absolutely extremely well. They're already selling tens of millions of these machines every single year, and farmers are extremely excited about the potential to solve one of the biggest problems for them.
And how are they killing the weeds with the laser? Is that what you said? Or
yeah, so this machine drives along a row crop, identifies using computer vision what's a weed versus what's a plant. And being on these farms, I mean, it's really hard to tell, at least for me, what was a baby carrot versus what was a baby weed, for example. But machine learning does, and so it identifies what it is, and as it's moving, it'll shoot the weed using a laser and killing the weed. So it's a bit more frontiery than a lot of the stuff we invest in, but we like these, just a big problem in one of the largest verticals in the world.
Fascinating. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't have expected that company would have been in your portfolio.
Yeah.
Are there any other ones you want to highlight, or?
Yeah, I'll do one more. There's a company called Wellsaid Labs. And so, Wellsaid spun out of the late Paul Allen's AI incubator in Seattle, AI2. And what they built is the best synthetic voice application on the market, best synthetic text to speech. And so they started selling to content creators, particularly in large enterprises that are producing a lot of content that historically have hired a lot of voice actors. So I don't know if any of you folks have ever worked at a big company and sat through any of those boring training and education videos or ongoing e-learning videos, but for all those videos, typically you have to go hire a voice actor. And if there's any move ad change, it's expensive, it's painful to find, painful to manage. And so all that content creation and production is now being done on Wellsaid. And this business has absolutely been ripping. It's on a tear. People are spending 4 or 5 hours every single day in the platform building these next generation content using their synthetic voices.
We actually had Jacob from AI2 on one of our calls, and he also highlighted that company.
Yeah, it's a cool one.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We have a question from June Swatsell. June, do you want to provide your question?
Sure. First of all, Cameron, could you please put a link into that laser weeder company?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'll do that right now.
That was just fabulous. I was wondering, do you know of an example of a successful startup that gained traction, started in the beginning just creating a great product and working on getting traction, but didn't figure out the business model when it was starting out and figured it out after it got traction? Business model, that's what I'm.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of times that actually happens, meaning, these founders, they're early on, they're so focused on building product and building a product that really solves a customer problem, which is great. I mean, that's the right thing to do. And then that's typically when we invest, is when they've either have very clear vision to do that or have built a product that customers are using and really liking. But oftentimes they really haven't figured out the core business model. And that can change over time. I mean, even the first company that we invested in, this company called Owl, an insurance software company, they built an incredible product. They had a lot of customers, paying for it. They, over the past year, started to re-architect their business model to go into more of a I guess less of a usage-based pricing model and more of a SaaS-based model. And that's been incredible for the business to align incentives with their end customers. And so, yeah, we see it quite a bit. And we will take business model risk when we invest, because we know that we'll go to work helping these founders figure it out. And sometimes that just takes a few years to figure out. So absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Very good question, June. Thank you. I'm going to transition a little bit to kind of structuring deals, because a lot of the people that in companies I work with, they're constantly getting different opinions about how they ought to optimally structure their financing. So my first question to you is, do you generally structure your investments as preferred stock, convertible notes, safes, and my guess is you've probably done a little bit of each, but what's your commentary on that? And if you had a preference, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've heard a lot of different opinions on this. I mean, at the end of the day, we try and be flexible to what the founder is optimizing for and what the founder wants. And so we've done both, a large number of both, particularly at the early pre-seed stages. We see more convertible notes and more safes. At the later stages, if we're investing in a late seed or Series A round in the company and we're investing over, call it 3, but on average more like the 5 to 7 range. We probably want that. We want that to be done on a price round. We want the proper governance to be established, the proper board to be established. And, you know, I think I tend to prefer price rounds just because I think it's great when the founders know at any given time how much of the business they own. It can get very confusing and hard to do that math, especially when these notes start to stack on top of each other. But the flip side, early on, I mean, sometimes it just doesn't make sense to pay the cost to do it, and you can sign up $1 million or $1.5 million or $2 million on a convertible note, or even less, and get going, get in business. Then great. You know, there's tax implications of that for the investor. It might not qualify for small business tax credit, but if it's saving the founder time and money, then we're willing to be flexible on that front.
Okay. If I were to ask you of the 17 deals, what percent of those might have been safes?
Probably 7.
Okay.
So a little under half.
Okay.
And I guess safes and convertible notes. I don't know the breakdown between convertible.
Yeah. It's an interesting world out there. Back in the day when I got started doing this in the late 90s, everything was a priced round. Then occasionally you'd have a convertible note, and that was really just a bridge in between one round to the next. And
Right.
It's clearly changed since then, but fascinating. You know, how should an early stage company think about how much they should raise? And let's assume it's a seed round, not a pre-seed round. It's a seed or maybe even a Series A. What's the right way to think about, if you can put any metrics around it, how much a company ought to raise?
Yeah, I mean, I think you should think about assuming you want to keep raising capital, what are the next round metrics that you want to hit that'll give you the no-brainer next round to the next investor. And so if you're at $1 million of ARR, what do you need to do in terms of hiring and investing to hit 3 or 4 million, for example? And then how much will that cost? And then come up with a little bit of an extra buffer. And so you raise money at least for 24 months, because, you know, if not more, because you will probably take you 12 to 18 months to get there and hit those metrics. And then you want to budget another at least 6 months before you're out of cash. And so think about what your key metrics are you want to hit for the next round, come up with a hiring plan to go execute on that, and then be sure to build in some buffer. I think some of the mistakes that we see on that side is the lack of clarity there. And so sometimes we'll get responses like, well, you know, we'll raise as much as you'll give me, type of, or like, you know, we can put as much money to work. It's more about is there clarity in the founders, you know, thinking about that next stage and those key metrics. And then we underwrite that and we say, okay, this is how long we think it's gonna take, and then if there's a delta between what the founder says, then we have a conversation about it and come up with the right number. I mean, there's been times where we said we should raise a little more.
Yep. I've never seen a company that raised a little more than ever regretted it.
Right.
A little more. Sometimes companies are forced or recommended that raise a lot more, and that can be disastrous. But raising a little more is never a bad idea.
I think that's spot on. And the a lot more, I think a lot of times now people don't talk about like the liquidation preference. I mean, if you're a founder and you raise 50 and you sell it for 50 million, you get 0 back, right? So it's the pressure that you have on the next round is very high when you raise a lot of money at a high price, and that gets lost sometimes because it's a sexy offer can be enticing.
Yep. I've got a number more questions, but we're getting a couple in the chat here, so I'm going to turn it over to the people in the audience. Chris, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Cameron. This has been super interesting. And just going off of the idea that there's usually more ideas than money out there, and also your comments on creating a system for finding talent for your companies. Just interested in your thoughts to take it up a level. when you're talking about entrepreneurs or budding entrepreneurs and creating new businesses, in terms of creating systems to draw those budding entrepreneurs out, to give them confidence to start a business, and just generally your thoughts on creating that pipeline of new businesses that you can potentially help going forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, for us, it's just always be willing to get on the phone, spend time. Like, I think if you look at us versus other venture firms, we will get on the phone and just have the candid conversation with the entrepreneur, and or if they're still at their previous businesses, in terms of some of the risks, what they should think about, at what stage would we think about funding a business like this, and just provide that honest and transparent feedback, and maybe connect them to a few folks that can help on the customer discovery side. And so it's we want to get to know founders, given we invest $250K all the way to $7.5 million at those early stages, but inevitably, really what we look for at the earliest stages is founder market fit, not product market fit. And so if it's a market that we know well and have been tracking for a while, and it's a founder that has the right level of insight or experience in that space, then we'll go early in a seed investment. And even if it's a space that we don't know as well, or we'll just look to help the founder make that decision and give them comfort around it. And there's a couple other organizations that have more programming and resources around that do a little bit more, on like the very early stages. There's an organization called Venture Out here in the Pacific Northwest. Like, if you're at a company, you're thinking about starting a business, they have a community of other like-minded people, and then they'll connect you through some programming to investors and whatnot. But for us, it's just always be willing to get on the phone.
Great.
Part of that old school approach, huh?
Yeah.
It works. One last question, Rick Rep.
Thanks, Cameron. Fuse is still relatively new, so you probably haven't faced this question with the 17 investments you've made in the past couple years. But going back to like your Ignite experience, I'm wondering how often it was necessary as an investor to sort of push for a replacement of the CEO in order to help grow the company.
Yes, this is a good question. I mean, for us, we always like to have those conversations very early, hopefully pre-investment. Like, what are your ultimate goals for the business? Get alignment there. And then inevitably there might be times where you invest, and a few years down the line, the original founder hits a point at which, they might be better served in leading or leading engineering or deep learning or in an evangelism role. And so those can be tough conversations, but they can also be very smooth conversations, particularly if you've been communicating over time, like how their role will evolve. And so, I haven't been given when we invest, we're minority owners of these businesses, we're owning 20% or less. We're oftentimes one of, if not one of two outside investors. We're never coming in and replacing founders off the bat. It's just not our business. But over time in the later stages, it's just about having those transparent conversations and just saying, hey, here are your strengths, what you're really good at. Why don't we, what are your thoughts about doubling down and focusing on that and getting them introduced to people that they can get comfortable to run and be the CEO. And there's a number of ways that's been done very gracefully and successfully. A couple of UW founders at a company called HashiCorp that just went public, they both stepped aside early in the company's journey, and that thing has been one of the biggest success stories to come out of this region that no one talks about because they relocated to San Francisco, but they both came out of Seattle.
It's a very delicate topic that is not easy to handle, but undoubtedly comes with the turf of investing in early stage companies. Well, it's 1 o'clock, and I want to be very respectful of your time and everyone else, but really appreciate you enlightening us for this hour, and we'd love to have you come to Spokane. And if you were to schedule a trip over here, I'd be delighted, and others on the phone would be, to introduce you to some of our interesting startups in the area. So hopefully we can make that happen sometime in 2022. And I do know of one company you're looking at over here, so we'll see what comes of that. Before we depart, I just kind of wanted to highlight a couple of other upcoming events we have. On next week, on February 10th, we're going to experiment with something called Brainstorm and Brew, where we've invited in a number of kind of very early stage entrepreneurs and students from local universities and community colleges, just to vet very early stage ideas and just kind of have a discussion about whether or not there might be a there. And that's going to be held at the Loft. Also on February 16th, we have a Lofty lunch with Richard Denny, Chairman and CEO of Lee & Hayes here in Spokane, and he's going to talk about intelligent IP development. And then lastly, up on the screen here, we have our annual Ignite 25+5 award, which highlights and acknowledges and features the most compelling 30 companies in the Spokane area. And we're doing that in conjunction with the Journal of Business, and also sponsored by Clifton Larson Allen, Primera, and Uptick. And you can get the tickets for that on the Ignite website. So 3 more events to think about. But with that, I just want to thank you again, Cameron, and thank everyone else for participating, and hope you enjoyed the rest of Groundhog's Day.
Appreciate the time. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Take care.
And thank you.